He thought she was just another black woman he could intimidate, until she stepped into court and dismantled everything he had built. The road was nearly deserted that night. A few cars passed by, their headlights glinting off the wet pavement. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the stretch of highway just outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was late, just past 11. That in-between hour when most people only want to get home. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had been driving for close to 2 hours. Her fingers tapped a soft rhythm on the steering wheel as she hummed along to an old jazz tune floating from the speakers. She wasn't in uniform, just a plain black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back. She didn't expect to stand out. But then she saw them in the rearview mirror, red and blue lights flashing, closing in fast. Her stomach tightened, not from fear, but from weariness. She knew how these encounters could go. With a tired sigh, she signaled, changed lanes, and guided her car to the shoulder. She shifted the car into park, took a slow breath, and kept both hands visible on the wheel. Years in the military had taught her exactly how to handle moments like this. A white patrol car rolled to a stop behind her. The officer didn't rush. He stepped out with the slow confidence of someone used to unquestioned authority. His boots scraped against the pavement, one hand resting casually on his belt, the other gripping a flashlight that clicked on as he approached. Renee turned her head slightly, watching him through the side mirror. The badge on his chest caught a glint of light. Briggs, license and registration, he said. No greeting, no reason for the stop. Just a clipped mechanical tone like he was reading from a script he'd memorized long ago. Renee met his eyes in the mirror, then moved carefully, slowly, reaching into the glove compartment to retrieve her documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her voice calm and controlled. Briggs didn't respond right away. He snatched the papers from her hand, holding them just out of reach as his gaze swept over her car. "Taillights out," he finally said. She frowned. "That can't be right." Briggs looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Are you arguing? With me?" A heavy pause filled the space between them. The kind of silence that comes right before a shift, when authority expects submission and waits for it. Renee recognized that moment. She'd studied it in military briefings, experienced it on bases overseas, trained for it in simulations meant to prepare sailors for life beyond the uniform. She understood the balance, when to yield and when to stand firm. "I'm just saying," she replied evenly. "My taillights were inspected a few weeks ago, but if there's an issue, I'll take care of it." "Step out of the car," Briggs interrupted, like he hadn't heard a single word she said. Renee exhaled slowly and glanced up the road. No traffic, no witnesses. She tapped her fingers once against the steering wheel, then reached for the door handle. "Mind telling me why?" she asked evenly. Briggs tilted his head with a smirk. "Because I said so." She let the silence stretch for a beat, then calmly unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. The night air was cooler than she'd expected. She moved with quiet control, relaxed, but intentional. She wasn't here to provoke a confrontation, but she wasn't about to be intimidated either. Briggs took a step back, eyes scanning her, calculating. She could feel it, him trying to measure what he could get away with. Turn around. Hands on the car. This time she didn't move right away. For what reason? Briggs stepped in closer, his smirk vanishing. "You resisting?" Renee stood her ground. "No, I'm asking a question." Something flickered across his face. Annoyance. Maybe amusement, maybe both. Then without warning, he raised his radio. "We've got a non-compliant driver," he muttered into the mic. Then louder, "Turn around." Her pulse quickened, but her face remained calm. "Officer, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low and firm. "I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and exactly what you're not allowed to do." That struck a nerve. His jaw clenched. "You're under arrest," he snapped, reaching for her wrist. Renee reacted instantly, shifting just out of reach. "Under arrest for what?" Briggs pulled out his cuffs. "For obstructing an officer." She exhaled sharply through her nose. So that was his move. The playbook was all too familiar, and now her military training took over. Her heartbeat stayed steady. Breathing controlled, Renee knew she had two options: comply and fight it later, or resist and risk everything escalating. She wasn't about to become a headline. With calm, deliberate movements, she turned and placed her hands on the roof of her car. The metal felt cold beneath her palms. Briggs didn't hesitate. He yanked her arms behind her back and slapped the cuffs on, too tight, intentionally, then shoved her toward the patrol car. "You don't know what you're doing," she said quietly. Briggs gave a short laugh, shoving her into the hard plastic seat. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing," but he didn't, not even close. The seat was unforgiving against her spine. Renee sat still, her wrists already aching from the pressure of the cuffs. Her breathing stayed level. The door slammed behind her, locking her in. Outside, Briggs strolled back to his vehicle, muttering into his radio with the swagger of someone who thought he was untouchable. She looked at the partition separating her from the front seat. Her reflection stared back, calm, composed. But beneath that surface, something burned. She'd faced combat drills, classified operations, interrogations in hostile zones. But this was different. This was domestic. This was personal. This was a man with a badge and an ego. Minutes passed. First 3, then 5, then 10. She shifted slightly, testing the cuffs. Too tight. Deliberate. Finally, the driver's side door opened. Briggs slid into the seat, still whistling like it was just another night. "Well, well," he muttered, pulling his seatbelt on. "Let's take a little ride." Renee said nothing. He dropped the car into gear and pulled off the shoulder. The patrol car surged forward, red and blue lights still spinning in the dark. The red and blue lights reflected in the side mirrors, casting long flashes onto the road behind them like a warning echo. "You know," Briggs said after a moment, "most people just shut up and get out when I tell them to." Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest someone for asking a question during a traffic stop." Briggs laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "I don't think. I know. That hit." Just for a second, his knuckles tightened around the wheel. A flicker of irritation slipped through his cocky mask, quickly buried again. "You military?" he asked, his tone shifting, curious now, maybe cautious. She didn't answer. "Yeah. Figured," he muttered. "You've got that look, that attitude, like you're above the law." He smirked. "Bet you thought dropping that would make me back off, huh?" Still, she said nothing. Briggs clicked his tongue. "Shame," he said, as if disappointed. "If you'd just kept quiet, we could have skipped all this." Renee's jaw tensed. The nerve of him, to act like she was to blame for his abuse of power. The station appeared up ahead. A low, squat building of gray brick tucked just off the main road. The parking lot was mostly empty. Late-night bookings didn't draw much of a crowd, and tonight it looked like she'd be the only one processed. Briggs pulled into a marked space near the entrance, cut the engine, and turned to glance at her. Through the partition. "Gotta say," he murmured almost to himself, "I do love when they make it easy." Before she could respond, he was out of the car, the door slamming behind him. A second later, her door swung open. "Let's go," he ordered. Renee stepped out, twisting her wrists slightly in the cuffs, testing the limits, keeping her movements steady. The cuffs dug into her wrists. Briggs hadn't eased them at all. Still, Renee kept her head high as he led her inside. They passed a bored-looking desk sergeant and moved into the processing area. The air was thick with the stale scent of old coffee and sweat. A metal bench lined the far wall, and just beyond it, a heavy steel door led to the holding cells. Briggs finally removed the cuffs, just long enough to run her through booking. Fingerprints, mugshot, routine. The officers behind the desk barely acknowledged her, going through the motions with mechanical disinterest. She recognized that kind of apathy. It was the same indifference that allowed men like Briggs to operate unchecked. When the process was over, he grabbed her wrist again and tugged her toward the holding cells. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered, low and bitter. She looked at him sideways. "I don't have to think." His grip tightened. She knew that one landed. Enjoy your stay, Briggs sneered, shoving her toward the open cell. Renee caught herself before she stumbled. She turned back slowly, locking eyes with him as the metal bars slid shut. Briggs stood on the other side, smirking as he tapped the bars with his fingers, then walked away. The lock clicked into place. Renee inhaled deeply, then sat on the cold bench. The chill pressed through her jeans, anchoring her. Just one night. That's all this would be. Because Briggs had no idea who he had just picked a fight with. The bench was hard, unwelcoming. She adjusted her position slightly, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness settling in. The cell was bare. 4 walls, a flickering light, and the lingering scent of sweat and bleach. She'd endured far worse in places, where discomfort wasn't the danger, where life and death hung in the balance. This was nothing, but that didn't mean she wasn't furious. From beyond the bars, the low murmur of officers drifted in, calm, careless, unaware. They had no idea what was coming. From the front desk came the low murmur of conversation, the occasional shuffle of papers and the dull clink of a coffee cup hitting a tabletop. Renee exhaled slowly, deliberately. Control the breath, control the mind. Basic training had etched that into her long before she ever deployed. Then, footsteps. Heavy, confident, Briggs. She recognized the cadence before he even appeared. Arrogant, self-assured, the gait of a man who believed he was untouchable. A moment later he stepped into view, arms folded across his chest, that same smug expression stamped across his face. "Comfy?" he asked. She said nothing. He tilted his head and stepped closer to the bars. "You know, if you'd just played along, you wouldn't be sitting in there right now." A slow smile pulled at the corners of her mouth. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." That caught him, just for a heartbeat. The smirk twitched, annoyance flashed in his eyes, maybe doubt. But he recovered quickly, scoffing as he looked around the quiet holding area. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady," he said with a shrug. "Guess that means you've got time to think about that attitude of yours." Renee didn't respond, didn't flinch. Briggs leaned in, voice dropping. "See, here's the thing," he said. "People like you think the rules don't apply. You walk around with a little swagger and think that's enough to keep you out of trouble." She let him talk, let him hear himself. Because it didn't matter, not anymore. He was already finished. He just didn't know it yet. Then, like clockwork, another officer stepped into view from the hallway. Younger, maybe late 20s, in full standard-issue uniform. He stopped a few feet from Briggs, clipboard in hand, hesitating. Sergeant?" the younger officer said, voice uncertain. "We got a call." Briggs barely acknowledged him, but the shift in the air was instant. And Renee saw it, the beginning of the unraveling. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "I think you need to see this." Briggs scowled, shot Renee one last look, then turned and followed him out of view. She leaned back slightly, listening. Their conversation was low, but fragments drifted toward her. Something about a lawyer, a call from someone high up, and questions about why she was being held at all. Briggs's voice dipped into a harsh whisper, tight, clipped, angry. The younger officer stammered in response, clearly caught off guard. Whatever he said only made things worse. Then, those familiar heavy footsteps again. Briggs stormed back into view, jaw clenched, fists tight at his sides. The smugness was gone. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded. Renee leaned forward, elbows resting casually on her knees. "I didn't do anything," she said coolly. She tilted her head just slightly, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "But people talk, and some of us," she added, "have friends in very high places." His face hardened. She saw it, that flicker of recognition, the slow, dawning realization that control had slipped through his fingers. He wasn't holding the cards anymore. Without another word, he spun on his heel, muttering to himself as he disappeared down the hallway. Renee exhaled slowly. It wouldn't be long now. And when the truth surfaced, Briggs was going to regret every arrogant step that brought him here. Morning light filtered through the narrow windows of the courthouse. painting streaks of gold across polished marble floors. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that crept into your bones if you sat still too long. Renee stood beside the defense table. Her stance was composed, easy, but her gaze was razor-sharp. No cuffs, no jumpsuit, no cell. Just a perfectly tailored navy blazer, a clean blouse, and a presence no one in the room could ignore. She wasn't alone. Beside her, her attorney, Carla Whitman, methodically flipped through a thick stack of documents, lips moving silently as she reviewed her notes. The fight hadn't ended in that, till it had only just begun. Carla Whitman barely glanced up as others slowly filtered into the courtroom. She moved with purpose, every gesture precise, efficient, without a single word wasted. Renee appreciated that. There was no need for chatter now. Then the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room creaked open. Briggs entered. He still carried himself like a man used to command, shoulders squared, chin tilted just so. But there was something different about him now. A stiffness in his gait, a flicker of unease in his expression. The certainty he once wore like armor had cracked. Renee met his eyes across the courtroom. He looked away. Good. Moments later, the judge entered. The room settled into silence. Judge Alan Kirkland, a man in his late 60s with tired eyes and deep lines etched into his face, adjusted his glasses as he took his seat at the bench. "Let's get to it," he said, voice gravelly with age and routine. He scanned the file briefly, expression unreadable. The prosecutor, a composed man in a charcoal suit and perfectly parted hair, stood. "Your Honor," he began, "we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained, without probable cause." He paused, letting the words settle. "Additionally," he continued, "new evidence suggests a concerning pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." A quiet stir passed through the courtroom. Briggs, seated, a few rows back, shifted in his chair. His jaw clenched. Judge Kirkland raised an eyebrow and looked at him over the rim of his glasses. "Sergeant Briggs, do you care to respond?" Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during what began as a routine traffic stop." Before he could continue, the prosecutor raised a hand and interrupted. "Uncooperative?" he echoed, voice laced with disbelief. He turned toward the bench, lifting a printed document from his table. "The record shows that Lieutenant Commander Dawson is a decorated officer, a Naval Academy graduate, and a woman who has served this country with honor for over a decade." He laid the paper flat, "and yet she ended up in a holding cell, without cause, without charge, and without explanation." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Briggs didn't speak. Because what could he say now? Multiple commendations, no criminal record, no outstanding citations, the prosecutor said, each line cutting deeper. "And yet you claim she posed such a threat that arresting her over a broken tail light was necessary?" Briggs opened his mouth to respond, then thought better of it. Silence hung thick in the air. The prosecutor didn't wait. He turned another page. "We've also reviewed your arrest history, Sergeant. It reveals a troubling pattern, an unusually high number of stops involving black drivers within your jurisdiction." A low wave of murmurs rolled through the courtroom. Briggs's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Judge Kirkland exhaled and set the case file aside. "Sergeant," he said, voice even but firm, "I don't like what I'm hearing." Briggs crossed his arms. "She resisted." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "The body cam footage says otherwise." Another ripple of sound moved through the room, sharper this time, more urgent. Briggs glanced at the judge, his posture suddenly more defensive. "I followed standard procedure," he muttered. The judge didn't budge. He looked to the bailiff. "Let's play the footage." Over, screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. The lights dimmed slightly. The video played. Renee didn't turn to watch. She didn't need to. She remembered every second, Briggs's curt commands, her calm compliance, the needless aggression, the way he tightened the cuffs just a little. Too much just because he could. When the footage ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, hands steepled on the bench. "Sergeant Briggs," he said slowly, "you violated protocol. You executed an unlawful arrest and you omitted critical details in your report." Briggs's mouth opened, but the judge didn't let him speak. "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson," he said, lifting the gavel, "are dismissed." The gavel struck wood. Sharp, final. "I am also formally recommending an internal investigation into your conduct, Sergeant." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. The tension, snapping like a taut wire, suddenly cut loose. Briggs looked stunned, his face flushed crimson, fists tightening at his sides as the weight of consequence finally began to settle. Renee sat still, composed. Then she let out one long, steady breath, controlled, unshaken. Exactly as she'd been all along, controlled. She never doubted herself. As she gathered her things, Renee cast one last glance toward Briggs. Their eyes met. No words needed. This time, she wasn't the one fighting to protect her name. Briggs stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps ringing through the polished hallways. His face was tight, jaw clenched, every muscle tense. He could feel the weight of every gaze. Officers, court staff, reporters who had flocked after news of the case spread. This wasn't the power he was used to. He was accustomed to control, the kind that commanded respect or fear the moment he entered a room. But now, that power was slipping fast, like sand through clenched fingers. Then came the worst moment. "Sergeant Briggs!" A sharp voice cut through the hum of the hallway. He turned to see Chief Eldon Baker standing with arms crossed, expression unreadable. The veteran had served over 30 years and carried undeniable authority. Briggs straightened instantly. Sir Baker studied him for a long beat, then nodded sharply, motioning him into a private office. The door shut behind them, and Baker's tone dropped low, heavy with disappointment. "What the hell were you thinking?" Briggs exhaled, frustration rising. "I was doing my job, your job," Baker scoffed, tossing a file onto the desk with a thud that echoed in the quiet room. "That's not what this looks like." He flipped open the file, pointing to the body cam footage, the arrest history, the fact Briggs didn't even know who he was arresting. Briggs flared his nostrils, defensive. "What does that have to do with anything?" Baker leaned in, voice low but sharp as a blade. "Everything. This isn't just some random woman. This is a high-ranking Navy officer. You think this is going to disappear?" Briggs looked away, grinding his teeth. "She was disrespectful. She questioned you," Baker interrupted sharply. "That's not a crime," Briggs scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't understand. People like that?" The chief's face grew stern. "People like what?" Briggs swallowed hard but stayed silent. Baker sighed, rubbing his forehead. "The district attorney is reviewing every case you've handled over the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling, and make no mistake, this department isn't going down with you." A knot twisted in Briggs' stomach. "What does that mean?" he asked, voice tight. Baker straightened, voice cold and final. "It means you're suspended immediately, effective now. Internal Affairs is launching an investigation. If they find what I suspect," he shook his head slowly, "your career is finished." The words hit Briggs like a punch to the gut, his face burning with anger. "This is bullshit," he spat. Baker raised a hand to silence him. "Don't finish that sentence. Pack up your desk, and if I were you, I'd get a lawyer." Briggs stood frozen, fists clenched at his sides, his world unraveling before his eyes. For the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't untouchable. Meanwhile, across town, Renee sat quietly in a cafe, stirring her coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The case was already making headlines. The footage had gone viral. "Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested," the headline read. "Officer under investigation." She wasn't surprised. From the moment she stepped out of her car that night, she knew how it would play out. She'd seen men like Briggs before, entitled, arrogant, used to bending the rules to suit themselves. Her phone buzzed, a message from her attorney. "Briggs has been suspended. Might face charges." Renee took a slow sip of her coffee. She glanced out the window, watching the city pulse with life around her. The fight wasn't over. Not for her, and not for the countless others Briggs had likely wronged before. But today was a win. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain as Renee stepped out of the cafe. The weight of the past 24 hours should have pressed down on her shoulders, but it didn't. She walked with her usual confidence, head held high, steps steady. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she recognized. She sighed softly and answered. "Captain, Lieutenant Commander," came the familiar voice. "I assume you've seen the news?" "I have," she replied, a brief pause following. "And how are you feeling?" Renee caught her reflection in a nearby storefront window. No signs of defeat, no cracks in her composure. "I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do," she said firmly. The captain's voice softened. "That's what I thought you'd say." A pause. "The Department of Defense has taken an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it." Renee exhaled through her nose. "Not sure I'm interested in becoming a headline." "You already are," the captain replied. "And whether you like it or not, what happened to you reflects something much bigger." She knew that, she always had. Briggs wasn't an isolated incident. He was part of a system that had allowed officers like him to operate unchecked for years. This wasn't just about her. It was about the dozens, maybe even hundreds of people who'd been in her shoes, but lacked her rank, her legal team, or the voice to fight back. Renee leaned against a streetlight, watching the steady flow of traffic pass by. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she said quietly. "And it won't be the last." "No," the captain agreed. "But it's the first time Briggs is facing real consequences. And that's because you didn't back down." Renee closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of those words sink in. She hadn't backed down. Not when Briggs pulled her over. Not when he tried to intimidate her. Not when the cuffs bit into her wrists, and not even after spending the night behind bars, knowing the odds were stacked against her. She stayed strong. And now, she'd won. The captain cleared his throat. "One more thing," he said. "You might get a call from the mayor's office." Renee raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Seems they want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace." She smirked. "Now that's ironic," the captain chuckled. "Are you going to accept it?" Renee paused, then shrugged. "I'll think about it." She ended the call and slipped her phone into her pocket. Across the street, a mother walked with her young son, his small hand clasped tightly in hers. He laughed freely, full of life and innocence. Renee watched them for a moment, the next generation. She hadn't just fought for herself. She'd fought for him. For every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Briggs couldn't wield their badges as weapons. Taking a deep breath, she stepped away, her stride steady, and her purpose clear. This fight wasn't just hers, it never had been. Power unchecked is power abused. And the only way to change the system is to hold it accountable. What happened to Renee happens to people every day. People who don't have the privilege of rank. Without connections or evidence to support them, those stories often go unheard. That's why it's crucial to raise your voice, to demand change, and never stay silent. If this story made you think, share it. If it made you angry, speak out. And if it showed you how much work still lies ahead, stay involved, because real change begins with honest, open conversations.